New York, London, Paris, Munich. Everyone talk about pop music. Episode 47, talking about U2's PopMart tour. And since there is nothing to do, nowhere to go, and it is January the 20-something of 2020-something as well, time has now become an abstract concept that's only marked by crossing things out on the calendar and rescheduling my gig calendar as well. The next show which I'm likely to go to is in April, although something tells me that's probably not going to happen. And since the next show I'm likely to go to is to see Nick Mason, the drummer from Pink Floyd, in all probability, the show may be rescheduled to a time after the band exists. I don't want to say that. That sounds terrible and awful, but I am aware that if you live forever, you also have to die in an attempt. And nobody has yet managed to crack the art of immortality, apart from possibly Mr. Burns and his robot dog, and the Highlander. And since I am neither of those, as far as I'm aware, I can be killed by methods apart from decapitation. It's very possible that maybe some of those gigs may never ever happen again. So lockdown tier 3, talking about U2, primarily because they're on my mind at the moment. I go through phases with bands where I listen to bands a lot, and then I don't listen to them for years. But in the current circumstances, my music listening has rocketed up, and my time spent not music listening has plummeted down as a result of not having in-person meetings and not spending time in places where I don't get to choose the music. That is one of the parts of the double-edged sword that is working from home for an extended period of time during what is likely to be the most catastrophically wide-reaching pandemic of my lifetime. We were talking downstairs earlier on about major world events, and the strange thing is history is what we are living through, and we are living through history right now, and we don't even notice, because in the same way that when a civilization collapses or a revolution happens, people still need to eat, we need to sleep, we need to go to work, we need to fall in love or fall out of love, depending on your point of view. All these things need to happen. And so even though history is happening around us right now, this is the week of the inauguration of the 46th president, and there is still time for an armed insurrection, revolution, and civil war in America, even though they are, frankly, leaving it to the last episode and running out of time, guys. Not that I'm suggesting that you do that. I hope and pray for a peaceful transition of power to a less racist, less incompetent, less corrupt, less stupid president. But we'll just have to hold on and see what happens. Now, who'd have thought when U2 released Pop 24 years ago that we'd be doing this? And certainly I would never have thought, well, I'm going to be spending afternoons talking to my mobile phone about records that have come out when the records that are more than half my age. So I have known the Pop album for longer than I haven't. It has been part of my life for longer than it hasn't been. And I'm, fast approaching the age of 50, despite the fact that I would like to think that I look obviously much younger and much more handsome. Later editions of this NOTCAST may feature my face replaced by someone like Brad Pitt or Leonardo DiCaprio. Probably not, but there you are. Frankly, I'll settle for being replaced by Richard Osman or Mark Kermode. Still, 1997, as previously mentioned on the most previous episode, and I will talk about things that aren't U2 at some point, I just don't know exactly when, by the way. 1997 saw the release of U2's Pop album. Mentioned this before, going to mention it again, and a very short kind of production period that ran into the band's associated tour that went with the Pop album. And so we have a number of factors around here. First and foremost, have to think about the launch process of Pop. Now, Pop is widely regarded as a failure, and the reason it's regarded as a failure is, amongst other things, the first single from the album, Discotheque, was launched into a world that didn't exist, with a marketing strategy that didn't exist. So in the 4 years in between Europa and Pop, the world had turned upside down completely, and U2 were faced with the approach where they thought, well, actually the first single that we released from an album can be pretty weird, we'll get away with it. It worked for Numb, it worked for The Fly, it didn't work for The Cure when they released The 13th, it didn't necessarily work for Depeche Mode when they released Barrel of a Gun, You know, these are songs which are not bad songs by any stretch of the imagination, but they're not first big pop hits. And it caused a change in the marketing strategy that U2 and a lot of other bands have had ever since then, which is your first single that you release from the album has got to be your big hitter. You can't rely on an inbuilt fan base that's going to be interested. And so therefore, you know, the world had changed from condensation on the record. The world had changed from you know, the 1993 when Numb came out, when Discotheque came out. You know, the album gets one chance, it gets one hit single, and if that hit single doesn't take, then the album's widely regarded as dead in the water, which, if I recall correctly, is the name of a great Noel Gallagher song. Now, Discotheque was clearly a step too far for the environment. It's a good song, great song. Loved it when they played it live. Worked really, really well. But to come out of the environment that the band had been in, you know, 40 months away from the world stage, they'd only released one really weird album, Passengers, and one single, Hold Me, Thrill Me, Kiss Me, Kill Me, since their last show, which was 3.5 years ago. The world had taken its eye off. Like, the eye of pop Sauron was no longer focusing on U2, it was looking at other things. So at 1997, for example, when this came out, Björk, Massive Attack, Suede, Oasis, bands like that, they were huge. You know? And most of those bands hadn't released a record before Acton Baby came out. You know, U2 were now settling into a second generation of pop, and there's also always a page in a band's career where they do kind of step away from things for a period of time. Normally it's around 15-20 years in. I've mentioned this in a previous episode, but I recently read an interview with Bill Flanagan where he talks about it actually in terms of, for example, the Rolling Stones didn't tour between 1982 and 1989. John Lennon took 5 years away from making records. You know, David Bowie didn't tour for a number of years. He was practically invisible in 1982. You know, every act has a period of time where they go fallow and quiet, and you can see this through other bands as well. You know, the Cure have a sort of a wilderness period between about 1992, the end of 92, and 1996, when they didn't really have a lineup as such, and they played a very small number of live shows. You can see it in other bands like Metallica. So between the end of 2000 and the beginning of 2003, the band didn't have a bass player, they didn't tour, they didn't release, they didn't do anything. And every band needs that moment, whether it's planned or not, where they kind of pause and stop and decide whether they want to come back at it, and whether they're going to be running a marathon or whether they're going to be running a sprint. Now, the problem with pop, as I've mentioned previously, is it's not a great record. There were rushed mixes, rushed recordings. Vocals were being finished at the last minute. Choruses were being written the morning the album was submitted. And the band really crunched their time down. And so when they launched PopMart in Vegas on the 25th of April 1997, the band just weren't ready. Full stop, they weren't ready. The costumes had arrived the day before. They'd not done one full run through of the show. And the show was due to be part of an ABC TV special called A Year in Pop that was going to show that even though the album, some of you might not be sure about the album, the live show, amazing. Except Vegas PopMart, the first show, is well known as being one of the disastrous U2 shows of all time. The big hit single they got wrong and they had to start again. For example, doing this live whilst being recorded for a TV broadcast is not the way to do it. Edge dropped his guitar pick during the middle of Discotheque. Some of the technology wasn't working. Bono's voice had been affected because he'd been spending a week out in the desert, and there's a condition called desert throat, which is a result of the atmospheric conditions inside a desert and the lack of oxygen and elevation, and that which also means that singing was very difficult. His voice was not great, and the early shows on the PopMart tour were ropey. There are several of them that are circulating. A number of the songs from the Pop album were dropped pretty quickly. So if you look through this, so for example, Do You Feel Loved was dropped in the first few shows. If God Will Send His Angels was dropped after the first few shows, if not the first one. Mofo had a completely different intro for the first few shows and was changed completely because they just couldn't get the intro to work on it. You know, and imagine having to do rehearsals and work out whether your live intro for the opening track of your opening song on your first American tour in 5 years, finding out it doesn't work by playing it live in front of 70,000 people for a few nights in a row before you figure you might want to do a different start. It was rough times, really. To be in the band. And I think the other thing also is the presentation of PopMart. And I'm going to go through the presentation of the PopMart show. Primarily, I'm going to go over here. Have a look at my fantastically interesting collection there behind me. By the way, it's not a record collection, it's a collection of audible art. I'm going to go through the PopMart show here, and you look at that huge, biggest video screen in the world. It was something like 150 foot by 50 foot. It was something like 750 square meters. When I saw it at Wembley Stadium, you could see the top of the stage poking out from miles away. So the first thing I saw of U2 live on that tour was I could see the grape and the very, very top of the arch there in the orange pumpkin, which was taller than the football stadium, for God's sake. And the sound design was very different as well. All the sound came from the speakers in the orange pumpkin that's there at the top, and the big yellow arch is clearly designed to be the McDonald's arch. So the band kind of took the idea that they had got for the Zoo TV tour, and they turned the presentation into a multimedia work of art. So PopMart is, and the reason why I've given PopMart a separate episode to Pop is because PopMart is a completely different entity from the Pop album. The Pop album effectively commercially was still born in many respects. The band were constantly trying to play catch up with the Pop album, so as I mentioned before, re-recording the singles, and they put out more singles for Pop than they did, I think, for almost any other album. I think they put 5, maybe 6 if you count Mofo as a separate single out. And having 6 singles from an album, that's almost as many as Michael Jackson had from Thriller. I think that's as many as Def Leppard had from Hysteria. And Def Leppard's Hysteria is a masterpiece, but I'm not sure it has 6 singles on it. Def Leppard may disagree with me. And so what we had with the tour is the tour was booked before the album was complete. So the band cut the rehearsal time down in order to finish the album, and they had to rush the album, and they didn't have the album as complete as they wanted it to be. And then they went straight into rehearsals, and the rehearsals weren't as good as it was meant to be. So for the first week or so of PopMart, you had U2 with an album that they knew wasn't as good as it could be, and a tour where some of the songs in the presentation and the performances were, putting it bluntly, well ropey. Now, there's another couple of things that happened around that. Ticket sales were not amazing on the American leg of PopMart. So for the first American leg of PopMart, over 155,000 tickets went unsold. So that's the equivalent of 2 football stadiums, completely empty. And the band had changed their touring model as well, so they'd gone from almost like a receipt percentage of the gross number of ticket sales to what I call a black box solution. So the tour cost about £200,000 per night to run, and that's whether there's a show or whether there isn't a show, given the number of people that are touring and the amount of equipment and technology that needs to roll. So if you're doing 3-4 shows a week, and then you've got costs of 1.4 million per week, you're then suddenly going, right, well, you need to do at least 1.5 shows, 2 shows, 3 shows a week in order to just stay afloat. And after becoming travelling t-shirt salesman on the on the Zoo tour, and making their profits purely in the t-shirt sales on that tour because the ticket sales were lower, the band decided to really raise their ticket prices so they could come out from the tour in a profitable position. So they changed the approach that they had. So Zoo TV tickets were about £22, 1.4 million-ish, maybe, on a sold-out stadium per night. And then for that tour, for Pop, the band were getting a set guaranteed fee per show. Let's say it's $1 million. I don't know if it's $1 million or not. With a running cost of £200,000 per day, a show every other day, which means that you're making 60% profit on that, assuming you do a show every other day. And every day that you don't tour costs you money. So the band couldn't cancel 10 shows, because cancelling 10 shows would have been £10 million. And £10 million would have been, could have put the tour into being a loss-making venture. And when you're at the point where, and the size that U2 are and carrying the amount of technology that they are, making a loss when you're headlining stadiums means that you're bad at business. And U2 realised on this tour that they were bad at business. Paul McGuinness said that they were flying steel in to Johannesburg from South America, and going, surely we should be able to rent the steel that we've got there, and thinking they're just carrying too much stuff. There's too many buses, there's too many vans, too many trucks. And as an example, for REM in the year 2005, one person on stage would cost REM around $500,000 a year in terms of costs, salaries, and travel, hotels, etc., and expenditure. And it's really expensive operation to run, and it has to run well. And if it's got too many people in it, and it's carrying too much equipment in it, too much technology, and too much redundancy, it can go under. So, and then of course 1997, the world had changed completely from the world that everyone else was living in, and U2 were kind of presenting a very European show. So in Europe, dance music, technology, and the meld between the two was very popular. In America, it wasn't. America never really took to dance music in the way in which Europe did. So they were touring a very European production in America, and nobody was really buying it. So if you look at this one here, which is the Sandboyd Stadium in Vegas, first night of the tour there, that is bloody confusing to somebody. If you're going in to see a rock show and you end up looking at a huge screen, you've got a McDonald's arch there, you've got speakers, you've got weird imagery which takes kind of like it's cue from people like Warhol, Lichtenstein, Munch, and you've got this weird and unusual treatment of everything. What you're looking at really is something which you're just going, I can't get it. It's very confusing. It's a very dense show in terms of its artistic presentation. And so PopMart is widely regarded as a failure. And I'm going to explain why it was regarded as a failure, because I'm going to get one of my many books out from here. I'm going to take this book here, U2 Live, a concert documentary, has a couple of things. So, for example, the band launched their tour by playing live in a Kmart, and people thought that Kmart were sponsoring the band playing live, and then what you had is another perhaps kind of pretty humbling moment for the band, and I'm going to quickly bring out, so November the 10th, Tampa, Florida. So that photo there is the band performing to 20,000 people in a 72,000 capacity stadium. It's raining, and the stadium looks empty, and 20,000 people is a lot of tickets to sell, but if you're in a 72,000 capacity venue, it doesn't look like you're selling a lot of tickets. It really, really doesn't. And up to this point, U2's touring had always been geared towards playing rooms that were full or sold out or nearly sold out. So U2 was a hot ticket to get, and if you wanted to buy a ticket on the day, you couldn't buy a ticket because U2 were too hot and too exciting. So it's all about making sure that the band were in the right size for their profile. PopMart was the first tour where they went completely to stadiums. I think they played one indoor venue in Australia, and that was indoor primarily because there wasn't an outdoor one, and they had to take the top of the PopMart grape off in order to fit it in. But it's still 30,000 people in an indoor venue. But if you're playing to 30,000 people and there's 42,000 tickets that are unsold, it's going to look depressing. And so the band had the stigma that they weren't successful, and this really affected, I think, their ego, because they changed their touring model, as I've said previously. They wanted to come out of this tour with money, and they had thought that they were going to be able to come out of the tour with money, and they thought they were going to be able to sell enough tickets to be profitable, to be able to carry on into stadiums. This was their payday. And I think the other thing that really put people off was the ticket prices. So 1993 ticket prices in the UK were £22, and 1997 ticket prices for the same venue, Wembley Stadium, were, I think, £32.50. Now, £32.50 for a stadium show doesn't seem that much now, but we are living 25 years later, and I paid less to see U2 in 2015 in the indoor tour. I paid £30 to see them in one of the shows. I paid less to see them in 2015 than I did 20 years previously, and I'd like to point out that there is no way that the inflation had gone up by 30% in the UK between 1993 and 1997, and other people were thinking the same thing. They were thinking, right, so U2 are playing a football stadium, they've done this album, which I don't particularly like, and they're asking me to pay a lot more money than I used to pay. I ain't going. I don't need to see U2 that much. They'd landed the wrong way with America. It just didn't work. Now, from a presentation point of view, a performance point of view, PopMart was a great show. It was a great tour. Everything worked very, very well, apart from those first few ropey dates. And I've seen the first dates of a couple of U2 shows or a couple of U2 tours. They're not fully 100% raring out of the traps, fully formed. There's still work to be done around them. And, I've seen them muff up a couple of songs on the first night of a tour. And I'm prepared to give them a chance around that. But it was a big, high-risk strategy, and the band needed to pull it off, and they didn't pull it off in Vegas. And so, they took a very different approach with PopMart. So they were presenting themselves as a brand as opposed to a band. They were presenting themselves as purveyors and sellers of music in a market. So, for example, you had here the three symbols. The band had started to use the lemon as a symbol of a corporate identity, in the way that a Coca-Cola can was the red and white of a Coke with a swoosh underneath it is a Coke thing, or the Adidas symbol as well. The band had started to brand themselves as a corporate entity that happened to be selling music, as opposed to musicians that happened to be a business. We do the show, we do the business, show business. That's why it's called show business, not show friends, and all the other cliches that go with it. But what it had done is people were not prepared for that degree of doublethink. They weren't prepared to go, okay, so I'm buying a product by the U2 brand that just happens to be a live show or an album. They still hadn't. People were still coming to the show and expecting to see music, and they weren't expecting to see what could conceivably, or should have perhaps, been in an art gallery. Because PopMart, which very clearly sold itself in three ways. Firstly, around pop as music, pop as a form of art, pop art, and also as art, but also the Mart with the M in there, the M for music, and the M for obviously a Mart. So selling themselves as almost like a supermarket of pop, and it was very. I think people had great difficulty grasping all of that stuff. Now, at the time, I like to think of myself as well, I'm going to sound big-headed when I say this. Fuck it, I am big-headed. I like to think of myself as knowing what's going on most of the time. And I was like, this is pretty ballsy, really pushing the boat out here. Pushing the limits of what people are prepared to accept. And I think people weren't as savvy about reading media and reading presentation and imagery and things like that as they were perhaps at the time. People are a lot more savvy now about it in the age of Netflix and the internet and everything that goes with it. That knowledge, you can just Google it and find it. Back in 1997, you had to know that stuff. You had to be able to have the books and all that, because it wasn't all out there on the internet available free to find. And about the information economy is just that degree of knowledge is, when I saw them do Bullet and Blue Sky, and I saw that Liechtenstein's power kind of painting, and it was animated and live in front of me. I knew that because I was the kind of guy that went to art galleries, because art galleries were free. And if you went on dates, girls kind of liked us. But I'm not most people would have been like, huh? Oh, that's exciting. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just that wasn't their frame of reference. U2 frame of reference for PopMart was not mass consumption. Some of it was really quite niche around that. And that combined with the poor reputation of some of the shows, Vegas being a bad show. There was another show, Sarajevo, a very important show for the band in many, many ways, but Bono's voice was really, really poor. I've only heard Bono's voice be as poor on one show, and that was the Berlin show, where he actually stopped singing and they stopped the show halfway through. But it's a really fantastic show in terms of imagery and presentation. And as I've mentioned before, here's the pop tour program. It doesn't look like it's a group at all. It looks like it's some kind of weird transmission from a science fiction Blade Runner, William Gibson type future, where even though, and that's the quote which I read out in the previous episode, all this stuff is here. These are colours you don't normally see: bright oranges, bright yellows, silvers, things like that. This is not how people were used to seeing U2. U2 were those dour guys in black and white with the hat and the vests that were hanging around in the desert and that. And this is just weird. And not weird bad, but just weird. And most people were like, I can't get to this. I don't understand what has happened to U2. They've gone strange. And in, again, this book, which I quote from liberally and freely at many, many times, Paul McGuinness says, we had enormous ambitions for pop. We wanted the production to beat Zoo TV. We were going to let the ticket price meet the market for the first time. They parted company with their agents. They had bids which were on the basis of 100 stadium shows all across the world, and then somebody had made an offer and said, well, we'll pay you $1 million per show, irrespective of the amount of ticket sales. It transferred the risk through to the promoters, but it's a high risk strategy that. It really, really is, and all the other stuff that went with it made it more difficult. So, and I think the material didn't help, because the material, if you're doing material that's got a high degree of technology in it, is that you have to make sure that the songs back it up, and you're not in service of technology, because otherwise the tools start using you as opposed to you start using the tools, and you become baffled by the possibilities of what's going on. So I'm well aware that I haven't given you a huge amount of visual stuff to chew on, and so here's some singles. Again, as I said, when the band were quoting liberally from art of the time, it was a little confusing, it was a little dense, it was a little deep for people. But I'm going to talk through what I regard to be, here's the PopMart Live in Mexico DVD, and as you can see, it really follows the presentation and delivery of the 1997 tour program. So it repeats, a few of the tricks that you will see from the tour program. But PopMart was designed, and it was, I think, the first U2 show where really I felt that the songs were picked together and decided by narrative. So at this point, the band weren't necessarily presenting a show in the context of, well, what songs work well together to get the crowd pumping their fists and drinking their lager and shouting them songs going, "Go on, Bono!" It was more about, the band were trying to tell a story, which is a theme that they've picked up and carried with narratively throughout all their tours previous to that. So the way that, the live show was constructed was very similar to an action movie. Actually, there's a change of scenery, there's a change of presentation about every 20 minutes. Something new and unusual happens about every 20 minutes, and there's also a change of I think context. So, for example, the first 5 songs on this tour were Mofo, I Will Follow, Gone, Even Better Than the Real Thing, Last Night on Earth, and that's a mortality sequence. So Mofo is very clearly about the death of Bono's mother and the effect that that's had upon him. I Will Follow is what he wrote to be almost like a suicide note to his mother, saying, "Wherever you go, I will follow." Gone, which retrospectively became about the death of Michael Hutchence, was also written about people going and disappearing and leaving and dying. Mortality is right all the way through the PopMart tour in a way that I think U2 have never really addressed elsewhere. Even Better Than the Real Thing and Last Night on Earth, you can thematically link those around the idea of, well, the last night on Earth is your last night on Earth. It's the last night that you're alive, and Even Better Than the Real Thing kind of gives you a transition through to an elevated form of reality, of almost like a metaphor for heaven. And after that, the band started to concentrate on their big hitters. So they went back to the Joshua Tree period. So even though they're in these weird and unusual muscle suits and cowboy outfits and gas masks, and they're coming on stage dressed like boxers about to do a title fight, they're then doing these very, very sincere songs. I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For, All I Want Is You, Pride, New Year's Day, and they're all songs that kind of remind people we're still the U2 that you fell in love with all those years ago. We just dress a little differently and a little weird now. And then the third part of the show, and we're about an hour in now, so maybe 45 an hour in, is an acoustic set on the B stage, where the band performed generally Staring at the Sun, maybe Desire, sometimes Sunday Bloody Sunday, 2 or 3 acoustic songs to remind people of the Zoo TV period before they move into the last part of the main set. And the last part of the main set is a thematic arc about crisis, conflict, resolution, and there's 4 songs that sit inside that. So there's Miami, Bullet the Blue Sky, Please, and Where the Streets Have No Name. And of course, Where the Streets Have No Name is the song that everybody loves to see. And by the way, the lighting that the band had during this tour, they only started using 100% of the lighting power and volume in the lights when Where the Streets Have No Name came on, because it was almost inevitably going to be dark by the time that they started playing that song. Before that, they were using less in the way of visuals, and they weren't putting out 100% of the power on the screen because they wanted that wow effect during Where the Streets Have No Name. So Miami, a song which I've talked about before, I don't particularly like it. It works very well live, but it works very well live as almost a song around the socio-economic and industrial military complex, which is then also thematically links into Bullet the Blue Sky, which is a song that was originally written about San Salvador, but has now become a repurposed U2 song that deals in all manner of things about politics and conflicts and war and death and general unpleasantness between human beings. So there was a fantastic moment, which is not captured on this DVD, by the way, but I remember Wembley Stadium when they played at Miami, and there's a pause, there's a few bars, there's a pause, a lull between Miami and Bullet the Blue Sky. And at that moment, almost all of the lights in the stadium went out, and all of the lights were pointed up to create almost like a halo of light, about 1,000 feet in the air, very, very similar to things like Triumph of the Will and the German rallies of the 1930s around the power of being a pop star and the power of presentation. And then everything crashed back down, all the lights came back on, and it went into Bullet the Blue Sky. And I wish it had been captured on this DVD. I don't know if they stopped doing it by the time they got to Mexico, because I've never been to Mexico. But what it did was it very, very clearly kind of pointed out that we're using all the tools of showmanship in a way which I'd never seen before up to that point. It was really bending the medium to serve the narrative completely, and to really go, look, we're really messing with what the possibilities of this show could be. Next up, after Bullet the Blue Sky, was Please. And Please, as I've mentioned before, is one of the best tracks off Pop, and I wish they played it live more often. And it's a song about the conflicts and the troubles in Ireland, which U2 have addressed a number of times through their songs. But it was perhaps, I think, a more mature approach than Sunday Bloody Sunday. Really works incredibly well live, as a plea to people to have a better, stronger, more cohesive way of thinking, and to be more tolerant of other people and their viewpoints. And then it moves into Where the Streets Have No Name. And I've always seen Where the Streets Have No Name as come as like a point where it's actually an audio representation of the afterlife or heaven. The streets don't have names there. It's nothing but a big white light, and it's a moment of heaven and release. And when I go there, I want to go there with you, and it's all that I can do, and all that stuff that goes with it. So it really is a love song to God. But it's also kind of sits at that point in the set to kind of indicate that if you resolve the problems, then things will be heavenly. Now, maybe I'm reading too much into this, and maybe I should get a job working as a professor of pop somewhere, with my specialist thesis about the religious undertones of U2 in their stage shows. But I think there are other people that are probably better at it than me. And also, well, I've got the beard, haven't I, actually? But I need to have the socks and sandals, and I need to have the tweed jackets with the leather elbows, I think. So maybe I won't be doing that. But that's my kind of interpretation of the main body of the pop set, is that it's a narrative that's built around a set of themes, and the songs are grouped together by the lyrical themes that are inside each one of those songs, and each one of those songs takes on retrospectively a new meaning by having its position inside the set list. And the joke in PopMart was that it was all sincere. It was just everyone was mistaking the rapping for the gift here, because the rapping and the presentation was so unusual and so weird. Because the band didn't look like U2 anymore. As Bono said in 1992, he said, "You didn't like me when I was me, so I came back as somebody else." And when you start to get to, and here's the Anton Corbijn book, which I've mentioned before. This isn't what U2. This isn't what you thought U2 looked like. They looked really, really very, very different indeed. Wearing these outfits, these sunglasses, these kind of outfits. I think this, this is not what you thought U2 looked like. Dressed up in muscle suits and outfits and weirdos. It was almost as if they'd become, avatars of themselves. Bono was playing a pop star called Bono, and that type of thing. And that's where, this type of stuff, I think, really, really kind of presented itself really strongly. But it threw people, and I completely understand why it threw people, and it's completely normal. So the tour was very well represented in terms of radio and TV broadcasts, by the way. Primarily because if the band thought, well, if the album isn't going to work, if people aren't going to be following the album, then maybe the tour and the live shows are going to be where it's at. So there's a number of live radio broadcasts, TV broadcasts, which I'm going to do. One of the major radio broadcasts was from Sarajevo, which unfortunately Bono had a problem with his voice during that show. But also the big one was, as I said before, Mexico City, which was on television. Here's the DVD edition of it, and here's perhaps the slightly less well-known video CD version of PopMart, which won't play in my DVD player, but the packaging is lovely, and I bought it in the days when I had a DVD player that could play video CDs, and in the days before PopMart was issued on DVD. So as you can kind of see, the presentation is generally very similar, but really I've just kept this for the art because the art is fantastic. Here's a bootleg CD of the Mexico show called Pop Martians. Unfortunately, they've called it Pop Martians with an S and not with a T, but it was £5 for a double CD, and I figured, you know what, I'm going to go with that. I can live with the spelling mistake in order to not pay an extra £25 for it. There's also a couple of bootleg DVDs that have been issued from the tour, and this is where we get to the South American leg. So when the band were playing South America, they were playing places like Buenos Aires. They played Sao Paulo. Here's a bootleg called Pop, but it has photographs from a different era because it's an unofficial DVD. That has a TV broadcast from Sao Paulo in January, and here's one from I think it's Santiago in February. The fourth show, which was perhaps very well known on, was Johannesburg, which was the last show of the tour on the I think it was 21st of March 1998, and the Johannesburg show was filmed by the director Phil Joannou for a film of his called Entropy, in which Bono and Larry from U2, as well as the director Cat, appear on his television and start talking to him, telling him how to live his life. And it's got some live footage from the Johannesburg show, and I haven't got the DVD because I can't find it. I know I've got it somewhere in the house, but my house is kind of like the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, and sometimes I put things down and I don't see them again for about 4 or 5 years because I'm that kind of dude. But all the footage from Entropy can be found on YouTube as well, and the plot of Entropy pushes the barrier and the medium of what a film is in the way in which PopMart did. So the plot of Entropy is a movie director, he's having trouble with his love life and finds out that his cat and his friends and Bono start talking to him in ways which he wouldn't expect. So, he sat there talking to himself, his cat starts answering back, Bono appears on the television and say things like, "You should tell her that you love her, man," that kind of thing, and then there's some footage of during the Johannesburg show, and there's some footage from a sound check. It's only about 6 or 7 minutes worth, so don't pay big money for it, and as I've said, you can find it on YouTube. But the band were really, they've committed fully to the PopMart concept, and they committed fully to seeing that through, and whether they believed it or not, other people didn't, and that was perhaps the first crisis of confidence that U2 had. Is they presented themselves in almost a Warholian version of the band. They presented themselves as here's some of the sleeve art and some of the, they presented themselves as a very bright, vibrant Dayglow band that was completely, out of step with the environment that they were operating in at the time. So it's a great record. PopMart, incredible tour. I think it's one of their best tours. Probably my favourite tour of theirs, up to the Innocence of Experience period in 2015 and 2018. But what it is that it's alienating. It demands a lot of the viewer and the listener. And sometimes you just want to dance to the band that you love and sing the songs that you love. You don't want to be challenged about the nature of reality. And so the narrative of the tour, was the first time where I felt, or I can see, that the band would follow a thematic narrative, a series of acts, 5 or 6 acts the band were going throughout the course of the show, which came to a resolution at the end when they played one and normally closed with Wake Up Dead Man. Now, bearing in mind, putting Wake Up Dead Man at the end of the album and at the end of the live show kind of ties in with the themes that I said right from the start, which is Mofo, I Will Follow, One, Last Night on Earth, about mortality, death, and facing that very, very clearly. And then at the end, putting Wake Up Dead Man as the last song on most of the shows, it was a powerful moment and completely threw me when I saw them play at Wembley, because I didn't realise that that's how the show ended. And I should point out, by the way, in terms of the live experience, in 1997, the internet just started, camera phones didn't exist. If you wanted to see what the tour looked like, someone had to post you a VHS tape of a single shot, single camera edit of a show. So you didn't. When I saw PopMart, I hadn't seen it on YouTube before, because YouTube was 10 years away from being being invented and being registered. So I was watching it and I was going, I have no idea what's going on with this. I didn't know that was going to happen. Now these days, of course, tours are designed around what they call the Instagram moment, which is every few minutes the band present or an image or a visual that will look good if you post it on social media, and it changes fairly regularly. Tours are very, very visual these days, in a way in which they weren't 20 or 30 years ago, and it's changed completely. And so U2's PopMart is completely different from Pop. And it's completely different presentation, because effectively what it is, it's a live presentation of the best of the band's work up to that point, in a way that could have been quite alienating, actually. And I think that really affected them. So they were playing, as I said, they were playing to 20,000 people in half-empty stadiums sometimes. And it kind of made U2 realise that perhaps they'd pushed this concept so far that they'd lost people on the way. You know, lots of people were on board with them up to Acton Baby, and they lost a lot of fans around Acton Baby. They gained a lot of fans as well, but so a lot of those fans that they'd picked up were not coming to the PopMart shows. And U2, unlike a great number of other bands, is they are willing to play to anybody who will listen. They are completely democratic in that respect. Everybody is invited. They don't want to say, I'm just going to play to these people or those people or whatever. So it's around a very inclusive show, and what they found is inadvertently they'd started to reject people, and people had started to not buy the product that they were selling. And so U2 needed to present themselves as remind people who they used to be. Hence the best of 1980-1990, released in late 1998. And as I mentioned previously, this was almost a course correction action at this point. It was a reminder to say, people, do you remember who we used to be? The band that we used to be? We're still those guys. You know, this is who we used to be. It's first time that U2 had done that element of looking backwards. Now, the use of the gold frame in all of the imagery that comes around that and the sepia tones is to say, no, this isn't what happened. This is a representation. It's a pictorial, audible kind of reminder of what used to happen. Hence why they also had the silver tones on the best of 90 to 2000. Now, chronologically and in my record collection, I put the best of 90 and 2000 after PopMart, and I put this after Rattle and Hum, although sequentially and chronologically this was released after PopMart as a way of reminding and restating people who U2 used to be. I think U2 had kind of realised that they started to lose people, and people had started to forget the band that they used to be, and they did this after PopMart and it was the first really obviously commercial move that the band made, as a way of saying to people, we're still those guys. You know, those guys with the hats in the deserts? We're still that band, we're still that sincere. And it did them no end of good from a commercial perspective, as I will address in my next episode, when I talk about U2's All That You Can't Leave Behind album. I have strong opinions about that album. So that brings us to a close with PopMart. Hopefully it hasn't been too tedious for you. Of course, this website is free, and if you don't like it, you can always go and watch something else. There's lots and lots of videos on YouTube around pretty much everything. There is an entire subcategory around grouting and DIY and golf, and if that's the stuff you want to watch, that's absolutely fine. I play to my strengths, and my strengths are known trivia about rock bands, and that's about it. So it's gone dark whilst I've been talking. It's Sunday I don't even know, let's say it's Sunday the 20th. Well, that probably isn't. It's probably Sunday the 19th. It's the Sunday the umpteenth of January 2021. Tomorrow is what is called Blue Monday, but Blue Monday doesn't exist, okay? The third Monday of January is tomorrow. It's not Blue Monday. Blue Monday is a song by New Order. It's not a marketing tool. Blue Monday was invented in 2003 by marketing people that wanted to sell you holidays so they could have more holidays sold during January. Obviously, during the middle of COVID, we ain't going nowhere, baby. We got staying power. As even the government have said, don't go booking holidays. So don't buy into the Blue Monday rubbish. Tomorrow may be officially Blue Monday, but please just listen to the song and dance around to Blue Monday instead. and I will catch you on the next episode, where I'm not going to be talking about U2. I'm going to be talking about something else, and I know there's going to be a chorus of cheers from some of you out there who have made it this far and go, can't you talk about something other than U2? And I will, and I shall, and I will continue to do so. But in the meantime, I'm going to wrap up here. PopMart is available freely to view on YouTube. Knock yourself out and remind yourself of what U2 were at that point. By 1997 standards, it was really brave, bold, and powerful statement. And I loved the show, and I think it was one of the best concert tours that the band did. Thank you very much. Don't be a dick in the comments. See you later. Bye.